We're in Chalcot Square in London, and behind me is the house where the American poet and novelist Sylvia Plath lived in the early 1960s with her husband, the English writer Ted Hughes. Plath is one of the most exciting, profound, and important voices in 20th century literature. For me and for many other readers, her work is deeply relatable. She has a way of describing thoughts and feelings that make you feel seen and less alone. The Bell Jar is her only published novel for adults and is a masterpiece of psychological, fictional autobiography. In 2000, a blue plaque was installed on the outside of the house to commemorate the place where Plath had lived. In her foreword to Ariel, Plath's last collection of poems, her daughter, Frida Hughes, describes this plaque and the controversy about it at the time. She says, "It was initially proposed that the plaque should be placed on the wall of the property in Fitzroy Road where my mother committed suicide, and I was asked if I would unveil it once it was in place. English Heritage had been led to believe that my mother had done all her best work at that address, when in fact she had been there for only 8 weeks, written 13 poems, nursed 2 sick children, been ill herself, furnished and decorated the flat, and killed herself. So instead, the plaque was put on the wall of 3 Chalcot Square, where my mother and father had their first London home, where they had lived for 21 months, where my mother wrote The Bell Jar, published The Colossus, and gave birth to me. This was a place where she had truly lived, and where she had been happy and productive with my father. But there was outrage in the national press in England at this. I was even accosted in the street on the day of the unveiling by a man who insisted the plaque was in the wrong place. "The plaque should be on Fitzroy Road," he said, and the newspapers echoed him. I asked one of the journalists why. "Because," they replied, "that was where your mother wrote all her best work." I explained she'd only been there 8 weeks. "Well then," they said, "it's where she was a single mother." I told them I was unaware that English Heritage gave out blue plaques for single motherhood. Finally, they confessed, "It's because this is where she died." "We already have a gravestone," I said. "We don't need another." I did not want my mother's death to be commemorated as if it had won an award. I wanted her life to be celebrated, the fact that she had existed, lived the fullness of her ability, been happy and sad, tormented and ecstatic, and given birth to my brother and me. As Frida Hughes relates, there is often a battle to shape an author's life and legacy after they die, and Plath is no exception. But Frida Hughes also mentions a gravestone, and you would expect that gravestone to be somewhere in London. After all, this is where Plath died. Or if not in London, then perhaps in her hometown of Boston in the United States. But actually, Plath isn't buried in either place, but in a small village hundreds of miles north of here, in Yorkshire. I want to visit that place to find out why she's buried there, but more importantly, to find out more about the person that her daughter describes in this foreword. I want to find out about the woman who lived, and not just the poet who died.
The next train to arrive at platform 2 will be the 1306 London North Western Railway service to Leeds.
The next station stop is Rotherham Central. Mind the gap between the train and the platform edge. Please retain all tickets, as you may need them to exit the station.
Sylvia Plath was buried here in Heptonstall in early 1963. The reason she's buried in Heptonstall is because this is where Ted Hughes, her ex-husband's parents were, and Hughes thought this was the best place for her. The inscription reads, "Even amidst fierce flames, golden lotus can be planted. According to Hughes, these were lines from Hindu scripture, which he used to quote to Plath. The other thing to note is the name, Sylvia Plath Hughes, but the Hughes has been scratched out. And for a long time, there was a battle over this gravestone, with people prizing off the letters that make up the name Hughes, and Ted Hughes himself replacing those letters more than 4 times, he says, in a letter to The Guardian in 1989. The reason that people prized off those letters was because they were outraged that such a prominent feminist author as Plath should have her ex-husband's name at the end of her own name. Hughes himself justified the decision by saying that Plath and he were never actually divorced, so Sylvia Plath Hughes was her legal name. But still, people prized off the letters in order to reclaim Plath for herself and to keep her independent of her ex-husband. In the same letter to The Guardian, Hughes complains that there were too many tourists coming here and they were removing the Devon stones that he had put on this grave. Well, now, several decades later, it's true that there are no stones left, but the grave is certainly not empty. People have left so many offerings to Plath: flowers, pens, necklaces, stones, and not to mention the poems and the letters that they've written to her as well. It seems that this is a real site of pilgrimage and ritual for so many people. They come here, they leave something for Plath. They perhaps scratch out the name Hughes as part of a ritualistic pilgrimage to the grave of such an important author and someone whose work has given them so much comfort and inspiration. It is tempting to think of the fact that Plath is buried in Heptonstall as part of Hughes' control over her. And it is true that Plath had very little connection to Heptonstall, only coming here a few times, and only because of Ted Hughes himself. And yet, this isn't just a random place for Plath. Plath had a deep connection to the landscape surrounding Heptonstall and took enormous inspiration from it. Plath first visited Yorkshire in August 1956, aged 23, shortly after marrying Ted Hughes. But she first imaginatively visited Yorkshire exactly 10 years earlier, when she read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte in August 1946, aged 13. The novel would go on to have a profound and lifelong effect on her. We're about 7 miles walk across the moors at Top Withens, the ruined farmhouse said by many to be the inspiration for the farmhouse Wuthering Heights in Emily Bronte's novel of the same name. And Sylvia Plath came here in September 1956 with Ted Hughes and wrote back to her mother saying that she was a veritable convert to the Bronte clan. And she waxed lyrical about the landscape here, saying, "I have never been so happy in my life. It is wild and lonely and a perfect place to work and read. I am basically, I think, a nature-loving recluse." She goes on to describe this place, Top Withens, saying, "How can I tell you how wonderful it is? Imagine yourself on top of the world, with all the purplish hills curving away, and grey sheep grazing with horns curling and black demonic faces and yellow eyes, black walls of stone, clear streams from which we drank, and at last a lonely, deserted black stone house, broken down, clinging to the windy side of a hill." I began a sketch of the sagging roof and stone walls. And we have that sketch, and we can tell from the perspective that Plath would have stood right at this spot when she was looking at the farmhouse. Plath also describes Top Withens in her article about Haworth, published in the Christian Science Monitor a few years later. She writes that Top Withens is nothing like the great frowning stalwart black mansion I had pictured as a young girl, munching on walnuts and apples beside a birch log fire on a wuthering winter evening and reading about the trials of Cathy and Heathcliff. And yet, so strong were my impressions of the book, I felt it within that presence which endows places long loved and lived in with a radiance subject to no alteration or ruining by wind and rain. Within stands and stands alone, ringed by the moors, like the centre of a pie, approachable from all directions. And you can tell just to what extent Emily Bronte's novel and this location gets under Sylvia Plath's skin, because she writes about both those things in her journals, where she sketches out possible future novels and stories based on Emily Bronte's novel and this place. Unfortunately, we never got to see those ideas fully sketched out and developed. Like Emily Bronte herself, Plath died aged 30 with only one novel published and finished. And yet we shouldn't really complain, because both Bronte's novel and Plath's novel, Wuthering Heights and The Bell Jar, are masterpieces. And yet we can't help but wonder what they would have done had they lived longer. Well, we might not have a novel based on Wuthering Heights written by Plath, but at least we have lots of poems based on Top Withens and the landscape that surrounds it. This is one of my favourite ones. It's titled Two Views of Withens, and it's from 1957. Above walled, spindling gorse, sheepfoot flatted grasses, stone wall and ridgepole rise, prow-like through blurs of fog in that hinterland few hikers get to. Home of uncatchable sage hen and spry rabbit, where second wind, hip boot, help over hill and through peaty water, I found bare moor. A colourless weather, and the house of Eros, low lintelled, no palace. You, luckier, report white pillars, a blue sky, the ghosts, kindly.
The poem makes the landscape around Haworth seem mysterious and romantic. The walls and ridgepoles are compared to the prows of ships exploring a hard-to-reach hinterland, and the ruined farmhouse is compared to the palace of the god Eros from classical myth. The alliteration, such as help over hill, gives a sense of rhythm and urgency, as if this wasn't just a ramble, but a journey towards something meaningful. Plath had a romantic view of England, inspired by the country's literature, as she explained in an interview in 1962.
I had always idolised England because I think if you're an English major especially, you think that here it all began, and you want to walk under Milton's mulberry tree at Cambridge, and you remember all the Dickens that you read when you were little, and suddenly you go to London and you recognise scenes that you have somehow seen before.
But it was not just London and Cambridge that contained scenes Plath had seen before. The ruined farmhouse of Top Withens was also one such scene. For another, we must go into the village of Haworth and the graveyard adjoining the parsonage where the Bronte sisters lived and where they wrote their novels.
Plath was inspired by this graveyard when she visited here in 1956, and that same year she wrote a poem titled November Graveyard about it. The scene stands stubborn. Skinflint trees hoard last year's leaves, won't mourn, wear sackcloth, or turn to elegiac dryads, and dour grass guards the hard-hearted emerald of its grassiness. However, the grandiloquent mind may scorn such poverty. No dead men's cries flower forget-me-nots between the stones paving this grave ground. Here's honest rot to unpick the heart, pare bone, free of the fictive vein. When one stark skeleton bulks real, all saints' tongues full quiet. Flies watch no resurrections in the sun. At the essential landscape, stare, stare, till your eyes foist a vision dazzling on the wind. Whatever lost ghosts flare, damned, howling in their shrouds across the moor. rave on the leash of the starving mind, which peoples the bare room, the blank, untenanted air. Plath often mentions ghosts in her poetry. For example, the damned, lost, howling ghosts of November Graveyard, or the kindly ghosts of Two Views of Withens. By ghosts, I don't think Plath means anything particularly supernatural, but rather the memories of people who used to live in a place, which would include the Bronte sisters. And if that's true, then Plath herself might be a ghost, although I think she's one of the kindly ones, not one of the lost, damned, howling ones. And if she is a ghost, then she haunts all the places she lived and worked, which includes London, Cambridge, Devon, Boston, but also Yorkshire.